I forgot what it said. Recording in progress. All right, last week we came to the end of Solomon's life, but we talked about this, but I kind of want to, we're not going to go too far back, but I do want to go back just a little bit. And if you go to 1 Kings chapter 11, this is not recorded in the book of Chronicles, but it is recorded in Kings, and it picks up in Chronicles the aftermath of this. But if you go down to chapter 11 in 1 Kings, we spoke about Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zeradah, servant of Solomon. So this man, Jeroboam was a servant. It doesn't go specifically into what he did. Some scholars that I've studied a little bit, and some scholars believe that he may have been in charge of some of the building projects that Solomon was engaged in over the time of his reign. And it may have been one of these things that filled Jeroboam with a sense of anger towards Solomon because of his heavy-handedness against the people, both in their taxation and in their being forced to work. We're not given to know that, but this is just some scholarly opinion. But God raised up Jeroboam as an adversary against Solomon. Why did God raise up Jeroboam as an adversary against Solomon? Because Solomon was not behaving and doing what was right in the sight of God. That's why God always raised up an adversary for either the king or for the nation. He was not in obedience. How do we know that? Because the scripture tells us that he multiplied wives to himself, and the wives, as he got older, they pulled his heart away from the Lord, to the point that even he began to establish places of worship for the gods of his wives. Now, if you're taking this for credit, you want to get this. These are the four gods that we know of that Solomon, I wouldn't necessarily that he himself worshiped them, but he certainly did not forbid, he did not keep his wives, his idolatrous wives, from worshiping these false gods. And in some cases, he actually established a place for worship. But these are the four that we know of: Chemosh, which was a Moabite god; Molech. I think everybody here knows Molech. It's probably one of the most well-known of the false gods. We hear about the Israelites even began to practice worship towards Molech, even passing their own children through the fire. Most agreed that this was child sacrifice. Some, wanting to soften it, say that, well, basically they passed the child over a fire and then back again as an expression of sacrifice. But most scholars do believe that this was an act of sacrifice. The child would be burned. Okay, a horrible and abhorrent practice. This was an appalling thing, even for the gods of the Canaanites. This was an appalling thing, but it was done. The Ashtoreth, which was a Phoenician god, and then we have Milcom, which was an Ammonite god. But all of these were mentioned as gods that these women brought to Solomon's front porch. Not the literal Solomon's porch, but to the front porch of Solomon's door, began to worship them, and then he acceded to that worship, and then he actually encouraged it by building places of worship. So this went up as a stench before God, as it always has. God gets angry. He raises up adversaries for Solomon. We read about two of them. The one that we're most concerned about, however, is Jeroboam. And verse 26, it's 1 Kings 11, verse 26, and continuing. We see where he is walking. Ahijah, which is one of the prophets, is walking with him. He has on the garment. He tears it into 12 pieces, 10 of those, and he makes this prophecy that God is going to wrest a portion of the kingdom away from Rehoboam, and he's going to give it to Jeroboam. Jeroboam will be the leader, king of this new nation, and God is going to leave two of the tribes, which are Judah and Benjamin, for Rehoboam in the south, but Jeroboam will be the king of these 10 tribes up in the northern kingdom. But I want you to pay close attention. Let's go down to verse 34. I'm sorry, verse 37. Verse 37. He says, I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and I will give it to you, 10 tribes. I will give to his son, but to Solomon's son, Rehoboam, I will give one tribe. Judah is already there. He's going to give him one tribe more, which is the Benjamites. He said, verse 37, he says, I will take you, and you shall reign over all that your soul desires, and you shall be king over Israel. Now, this is the prophecy. This is the promise that God makes. But remember, the promise always comes with what? Conditions, right? It comes with it. All of God's promises are conditional. Now, sometimes God says, this is what's going to happen. Sometimes it says, if you do this, then this will happen. But when God makes a promise, it's conditional on his determination to either make the promise or not make the promise. But look at what he says in verse 38. And if, that two-letter word, if, and if you will listen to all that I command you and will walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you and I will build you a sure house. Now, what does that mean, sure house? It means that nothing mankind can do will tear it away from him. It's sure, it's set, it's established. The word that we hear often. It will be established. God is going to plant it and nothing's going to uproot it. I will build you a sure house as I built for David. Now, what kind of house did God build for David? He says, you will never lack a man on the throne. So he's telling Jeroboam the same thing. If you keep my statutes and my commandments, then you will not lack a son on the throne, as my servant David did. And I will give Israel to you, and I will afflict the offspring of David because of this, but not forever. So who are the offspring of David? Those in Judah and the southern kingdom. I'm going to afflict them because of the things that they're doing. I'm going to afflict them, and we'll see here shortly what that affliction is. We read where the nations come up from the south and they begin to afflict Judah. But here he makes a promise to Jeroboam, but Jeroboam has something at stake in this, doesn't he? He has a part to play. If you keep my statutes and my commandments. Yes, ma'am.
The establishment of the sure house. This kind of harkens to the place in the New Testament where the man built his house on the sand and it collapsed because the foundation was sure.
Mm-hmm.
The other man built his house on a rock.
Right. And that rock being what? The confession of Jesus Christ. That confession is the bedrock of everything that the Christian believes, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. All right. So here he is. Interesting thing, or one thing we get to remember here is Rehoboam has not yet ascended to the throne. He has not yet taken control over the entire kingdom. But here he says, he makes this problem. I'll tell you what, let's go a little bit further because it'll explain a little bit. Look what he says in verse 40. Now, what is Solomon's attitude towards this? Remember what we've seen throughout our study so far, when God makes a declaration, even if it is an unflattering or an unwelcome declaration, godly men would say, it is the Lord's decision, let him do what seems right to him. They accept it. They may not like it. They may not even agree with it, but they say, it's the Lord's decision. Let the Lord do what seems right to him. What's Solomon's response to this news, this prophecy that Jeroboam is going to receive 10 tribes out of the kingdom?
He wants to kill Jeroboam.
Right. Verse 40. What does it say? Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. If you remember, if we go forward many hundreds of years into the New Testament, remember what Gamaliel says to the men that were gathered together, and they sought to harm the disciples that were preaching in the name of Jesus Christ. He says, what does he say to them? He says, be careful. Be careful what you decide to do with these men. Because if it is of man, then it will fail. And he starts giving examples, doesn't he? This man arose up claiming to be something and dragged a bunch of guys out in the desert. He was killed and all of his followers scattered. And then another guy claiming to be somebody arose and gathered a large group of people after him. And then he died and his followers were scattered. He says, be careful what you do to these men, because if it's of man, then it's going to fail. It's of God. If it's of God, then it cannot be overturned. In fact, you may be found fighting against God. But what is Solomon doing here? He is fighting against God. God made this declaration through a prophet of his word that Jeroboam would receive 10 tribes, and now Solomon seeks to overthrow the will of God. He's found fighting against God. His wickedness exceeds his righteousness at the beginning. His wickedness now exceeds what his righteousness was at the beginning. This is how sad it was. This is the man who stood before God and all of the people and dedicated that house of the Lord and sacrificed all of those animals and said, we will obey, we will obey, we will obey. And now where is he? He's an idolater. He's a blasphemer. He is an adulterer. And now he is seeking to even overthrow God's word. Could we rightfully say that Jeroboam at this time has been anointed one of God's chosen rulers? I think it would be reasonable. That would be a reasonable way to look at this. God has anointed Jeroboam to be king of the northern tribes, and here's Solomon. Now, what would Solomon's father have done? What was David's attitude towards God's anointed? You don't touch God's anointed. You do not harm God's anointed. This is God's decision. Even David, when God made a declaration, David said, "Yes, sir." But here's Solomon. He's going to try to kill Jeroboam. Yes, sir.
In that thought, it makes me think of the scriptures here, which kind of surrounding your first comment when we got started about weren't sure whether Solomon went after other gods. In chapter 11 there, we see verse 5. It indicated, actually 4 and 5. It said, when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And then in verse 6, it said, for Solomon went after Ashtaroth and the goddesses of, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, sir.
So I see that as Solomon going after or worshiping those gods.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This was not at first, it's like anything else. I've never seen a congregation, and I said this, I believe, last week. I've never seen a congregation of the Lord's body who one Sunday preaches the word and nothing but the word, and they are strong and they are steadfast, they are middle of the road, faithful. And then the next Sunday comes around and it's like a switch flips and they decide, well, we're going to go off into left field. It is a matter, it's slouching towards failure. And this is what's happening with Solomon. It begins, number one, when he took the daughter of the Egyptian king as a bride. And then he began to multiply wives to himself, began to multiply chariots and horses to himself, began to do all of the things and set his mind on the physical things of this world, didn't he? Remember what gold and silver? He was all about, in the words of the kids, he was all about the Benjamins. It was all about the almighty, we would say dollar, the almighty gold coin of the realm. Whatever shekel or however you want to refer to it, that was his attitude. So it's not out of the realm to understand and to believe that his disobedience in this part of his life carried over into disobedience in this part of his life. Now he is depraved. He's a depraved man. And now he seeks to kill God's anointed. So he has gone over into apostasy in almost every conceivable way. And remember, this is I believe one of his names was Jedediah, which means beloved of God. I mean, God saw something great in him, but then he proceeded to spit all over it. He had an exalted, one of the most brilliant minds in every way, wealthy. He could do anything he wanted to worship God and to bring glory to God and to bring peace and prosperity to the kingdom. But that's not what he did. That's not what he did. And I dare say that the beginning of it was his taking of those wives, because what did they do? They came and infected his mind. And then before too long, it was completely gone. But look what he says in verse 40. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt. How many of God's people have fled into Egypt to escape certain death, to be honest? I mean, lots of them.
I mean, with all those wives, it would have been possible for him to ignore the influences of those false gods.
Yes. Well, and think about if he went to Egypt, you'd think, well, one of Solomon's wives was Egyptian. But I wonder if the king of Egypt was happy that after he had given his wife or his daughter to Solomon as a wife, then Solomon multiplied all of these other wives, and essentially she's one of how many hundreds? She's just one more name. And he's likely, I would be very upset with that. So anyway, Jeroboam goes to Egypt, seeks asylum down there, and remains there until Solomon is dead. Okay. Now, the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? Now, we don't have that book, but I can imagine there was a lot of wisdom that came from the lips of Solomon. He was a very wise man, given wisdom by God. Not just the spiritual, but the physical. That would be one of those books that would be very interesting to read. Don't have it. But there are books of his wisdom that we do have. Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes. And both of those claim, especially if you haven't read the book of Ecclesiastes, that is one of those, it is a must read. It's like Job and Isaiah. Those three out of the Old Testament are probably, in my opinion, that's my personal opinion. Yes, sir.
He wrote Proverbs too.
That's true. You have most of Proverbs come from Solomon. Most of the Proverbs, some did not, but most of them did. And look at the timeless wisdom that's contained in there.
Yep, that's true.
It's interesting. He warns against the very things that he did. Goes to show, just because that was very much Solomon's attitude. This is not a good idea. Never mind that I'm doing it.
Yeah.
You don't do it. But I'll be honest with you, I tell my daughters that sometimes. I say, Dad, did you ever? And I said, it doesn't matter whether I did or not. You don't do that. It's bad. It's bad news, and you're gonna suffer for it if you do it.
I tell them I have done it. That's why I can tell you.
There you go. and if as long as you're honest with it and give the entire picture, there's no problem with that whatsoever. I won't tell them that I didn't do it if I did. I just tell them it doesn't matter if I did it or not. All right. So anyway, continuing on, and the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Again, we get back to the promise that God made that if you'll obey me, then I will extend your days. I'll make you live longer. But we see that Solomon died at around 60 years old. So he didn't even make 70 years like his father did. God allowed him to die earlier. And Solomon slept with his fathers, was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. I wanted to kind of go back and I wanted to bring us up to speed. All right. So now let's go. Our passages tonight, the run parallel, 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 through 33, and then 2 Chronicles chapter 10 and verse 1 through 11 and verse 4. Those are our parallel, at least for the first portion of our class tonight. Those are our parallel scriptures. All right, so let's look at chapter 12 of 1 Kings. And we see here where Jeroboam, this is Jeroboam's moment, because Rehoboam, unfortunately, out of all the wisdom that spilled from Solomon's mouth, his son did not learn what he needed to learn. The lessons that he got, he did not heed. All of the men that served with Solomon, his father, he did not listen to them, and it cost him the kingdom. Now, God, this was something that was going to come from God, but it just goes to show God's foreknowledge of mankind's foolishness. All right, so he knew this was going to happen. That's how Jeroboam came into the northern kingdom. All right, so look at what he says in chapter 12 and verse 1. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. So the prophecy had been made known that Jeroboam was going to be king of this northern kingdom, these 10 tribes. So he goes there, and they were going to make him king. But as soon as Jeroboam heard of it, remember he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt, and they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam. So now they're going to give him an opportunity, aren't they? Look, before this happens, before all of this occurs, this is our problem. We come and we bear this. It's a grievance. It's a grievance. They have a major grievance with Solomon, who is now deceased, and Rehoboam, his son. Look, this is the issue. He said, they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke upon us, and we will serve you. He said to them, go away for 3 days and then come again to me. So the people went away. So Rehoboam goes, they're going to make him king. Jeroboam hears about Solomon's death. He comes up out, and let's find out what's happened. Maybe he'll answer faithfully. Maybe he'll give us a pleasing answer, but also shows that Solomon's behavior, even when he was at the height of his powers of king, was not behaving admirably.
Started on the wrong foot.
Very much so.
Yeah.
He says, your father made our yoke heavy. Now, what kind of yoke was that? Number one, we know that he required service. All of these building projects that Solomon engaged in required service. People had to work, and hard. I mean, this is backbreaking work. They didn't have heavy machinery. They were doing all of this by hand. So he says, our yoke is heavy. So what kind of yoke was it? Well, number one, it was hard service. Number two, it was taxation. Solomon taxed the people heavily. But remember, this was God's punishment upon Israel for wanting an earthly king in the first place, because he warned them that this was going to happen. He is going to tax you. He's going to require, he's going to take from you. He's going to take and take and take to his glory, and you're going to pay the price. Now, what did the people say? Nevertheless, never doesn't matter. We want a king. So God said, all right, I'm telling you what's going to happen. This is what's going to occur. So the heavy taxation, God warned them about at the very beginning, but it doesn't change the fact that it's still heavy taxation. We don't want this. All right. And we shouldn't have to pay it. The kingdom is wealthy enough. Now, God brings humility to them in just a little bit, but let's continue to read. So the people went away for 3 days. King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who had stood before Solomon his father while he was yet still alive. These are older men. What do we typically know more often than not? Older men are going to be what? They're smarter. They're wiser. They've been around. They've had experience. They've seen everything that's been going on during the reign of Solomon, and they have a little bit of insight into what's going on. They had seen what Solomon had done as a young man and even as an older man, and likely they had maybe even been advising Solomon not to do these things, but Solomon was going to do what Solomon was going to do. But here's a chance for the right thing to occur. And Rehoboam, rather than listening to the older men who had served his father, what happens? They listened to young men that grew up with him, spoiled, rich, young men. They said, if you will be a servant to this people today, which is what the king was supposed to be, wasn't he? He was supposed to be a servant to the people. It's always been that way. The people who have the rule over God's kingdom today, who are they? It's the eldership, isn't it? What are they supposed to be? An elder is supposed to be a servant. They're shepherds. They speak kindly to the people. They seek their best interests. He says, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. So it gives us another little insight into Solomon. When the people came and complained to Solomon, what was Solomon's answer?
Well, let's deal with this issue.
Solomon's answer, tough luck. This is the taxation. And it got steadily, progressively worse. See, in today's society, what do? Well, if we don't like taxation, we'll get the people who are taxing us too heavily and we'll vote them out or we'll fire them or whatever it might be. This is the king. What the king says goes. He has ultimate authority. So if you answer them, they will be your servants forever. But he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. So now these old gray heads that know more, are wiser, have seen more experienced, and are giving him the correct answer. I mean, that's one thing we know. They were giving him the right answer. He goes with the men that he grew up with. Well, what kind of lifestyle did those young men have?
Well,
They were spoiled rotten. Anything they wanted, they were elevated above all the people. They had likely never had to do a lick of work in their life. Like the old saying, wouldn't hit a snake with a switch. They just didn't want to work at all. Yes, ma'am, you will say something.
Yeah, there's numerous places in the Bible that say most of us our peers are against it. Oh, sure, that's right.
Yeah. If you go to, this is on the site, if you go to YouTube, you see lots of videos with young men who are listening to other young men telling them, oh yeah, you can do that. Don't worry about it. You'll make it. You know, hey, I'm going to jump over this ravine. Go for it, man. You got it. You know, that's what young men do with young men. They're yes men. And that's exactly what happens. He says, what do you advise that we answer this people like this? What do you advise that we? It's not them. It's not those other young men. It's Solomon, or it's Rehoboam. Rehoboam has to answer this. He says, what do you advise we answer this? People have said to me, lighten the yoke. And the young men who had grown up with him said to them, thus shall you speak to this people who said to you, say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. In other words, my power is even greater than my father's. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. This is the absolute worst possible advice that they could possibly give him. If they had intentionally said, hey, we want to give him the worst advice, it couldn't have been any worse than this. So my father disciplines you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So everything that you've been going through is going to get worse. And part of it is the idea that how dare you speak to me in this manner? How dare you give me some sort of ultimatum? That's part of it.
You think if these guys never looked at their finger, you'd think they would want to go the easier route rather than the harder route, wouldn't you?
I think that that's one of the problems. And listen, we find this in today's society. We have more of a problem with an elite versus the lower class. You understand what I mean by that? You have people, it doesn't matter who they are or where they came from. You have people who genuinely believe that they occupy a rarefied air and they are they're superior to everyone else underneath. Almost everybody probably, I don't know, most people I know grew up with at least one, they knew at least one person, whether that was a friend or someone they knew, who simply believed because they had been told from the time they were young that they genuinely were better than everybody else. And the issues with the common, that is not your problem. You don't worry about that. You get what you want. And that hasn't changed. We still have that problem.
Chuck?
So I hear somebody?
Yes, this is Margaret.
Yes.
Don't you think that after Solomon talked to the old man, he really didn't like the answer? Because otherwise, why did he even go to the young men? Did you think he was hoping for a different answer?
Maybe so. He heard that answer and he already had something in mind that he wanted to do. We're not given to know the circumstances of how he did this. Did he call in the older men, speak to them privately, or while he was speaking to the older men who had stood with his father, the younger men are also there and they're shaking their heads and saying, don't listen to these people. They're old. They don't know. They're behind the times. They don't know what they're talking about. We don't know exactly what the circumstances were concerning this counsel that he's been taking, but it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. He had something in mind and he was waiting for somebody simply to tell him, that's it. And he may have had in mind, you know what, I'm going to make it even harder. I want more. I want more than my father had. I want to show who I am. I want to make a name for myself. And I want to get out from underneath the shadow of my father. And this is how I'm going to do it. I don't know, but it's a good point. You make a good point. All right.
I don't wives have gotten love, but how do you bring the man who was wise enough not to cut the baby in half to
Foolishness.
Over time, like I said, nobody does this immediately overnight. This is a slow descent into apostasy. And he was on the throne for 40 years. So he had plenty of time to go from this, and slowly deteriorate in his.
Was known for his wisdom and his, wise thing.
Well, I've known ministers of the gospel that I 10 years ago, I would have said, this is a man that you can listen to. This is a man that's going to tell the truth. And then over time, I wouldn't listen to them about anything. I know men like that. And it's sad. So no one is immune to this.
Sure.
No one is immune to this. If we start that slippery slope, if we start down that slope, odds are we're going to find ourselves at the bottom of the ravine and we'll wonder how we got there. It'll be a slow, steady thing. All right. There's such a thing as going down a hill when just for example, if you're snow skiing, how do you get down the hill the quickest possible? Straight ahead. I mean, you just go straight ahead and hope you don't crash at the end. But how do we most of the time go down a ski slope? You slalom and you go this slow, steady route. It takes you a while, but finally you find yourself at the bottom of that hill. This is the route that Solomon took. Now we're going to see later on that a lot of these kings, they took the direct route to the bottom of the hill. So, all right. So what does he do? The king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord that he might fulfill his word. So this is, God has a hand in this too, doesn't he? The question was proposed to Rehoboam, but at the end of the day, Rehoboam was simply abiding by what the Lord had prophesied. This was going to happen. He spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam. So we remember the case of Ahijah and Jeroboam walking side by side on that road. He says, this is from the Lord. The Lord's word will not be denied. It is going to happen. This little counsel that he's taken with the people was never going to achieve any other result than that which the Lord had decided many years before that. So when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king. And these are rhetorical questions. What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. And that simply means you might as well go home. Nothing is going to change here. He's not going to listen to us. His mind is as resolute. He's not going to change it. There's nothing more to be done here. We're going to go home. So that's what they do. Look now to your own house, David. You've made your decision. You've made your bed. Now you have to lie in it. But don't count on us anymore. Now we are opposed. Okay. So Israel went to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. So what's happened here is now the kingdom has been split. The 10 tribes of the north are now the kingdom of Israel, and that's how they'll be referred to from now on in the books. When it talks about Israel, it's talking about the northern kingdom, and Judah is the southern kingdom. But he also says the people of Israel who lived in Judah, they acknowledged Rehoboam as their king. So
Judah, right?
Judah, yes. Anybody from the northern tribes who lived in the south, they acknowledged, and there were several who did that, and that's one of the problems that Jeroboam runs into, because there are people who said, but the southern kingdom has Jerusalem and the temple, and this is the beginning of Jeroboam's monumental mistake. I mean, it cannot be overstated how big of a mistake this was for Jeroboam. But then Rehoboam thinks, okay, you know what we're going to do? I'm going to make one last ditch effort. King Rehoboam of the southern kingdom sends Adoram, who is taskmaster over the forced labor. Now think about who he's sending. He sends him to where? The people of Israel, the northern kingdom, to maybe try to work things out. But what happens? People stone him. Here's a man. Yes.
People didn't like the IRS in Old Testament times either, did they?
The tax man has never been popular. Never. The tax man, I mean, you think about who he sent. He could have sent anyone. He could have, listen, if he had been smart, if he had realized what the advice of those young men cost him, you know who would have been a good idea to send? The older men who tried to talk him out of it. Send some of those old men as a diplomatic effort. Say, listen, maybe we can still work this out.
About Jesus chose a tax collector.
Probably a little bit of animosity on the part of the other disciples towards Matthew. Certainly so.
He did that on purpose because tax collectors were anathema.
And that's why I said he eats with tax collectors and sinners.
And
Yeah.
Jesus says, those who are well have no need of them.
That's right.
Those who are sick.
Yep. So King Rehoboam, he sends Adoram, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. Good idea. Because if they had gotten a hold of Rehoboam, they would have killed him too. Now they would have suffered for that because why? Again, Rehoboam is God's anointed. He's supposed to be on the throne. He promised that to David. He promised that to Solomon, and it's going to continue on. That's not going to go away until the southern kingdom is torn away by Nebuchadnezzar. So he goes, he mounts his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned to Israel, meaning the northern kingdom, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. But remember, God gave him the tribe of Benjamin. So Judah was there, but the tribe of Benjamin was with him. Now that his pathetic attempt at diplomacy has failed, now he's going to try an armed response. And here's where God has to say, stop. Just stop. This is not going to go any further. When Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he goes back and he says, all right, they killed my taskmaster. Now we've got to bring down the hammer. He assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen warriors to fight against the house of Israel to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. Remember, this was not going to happen because this was of God. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, and he says, say to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, and to all the house of Judah, thus says the Lord, verse 24, you shall not go up or fight against your relatives, the house of Israel. Every man must return to his home, for this thing is from me. So God has to make sure that Rehoboam knows in no uncertain terms, this was not just a man who decided that he was going to take over. This is not just a man who has initiated a coup against you. He's not simply in rebellion. This thing is from me. I have taken these tribes away and I have given them to Jeroboam and they are his. But remember what God says to Jeroboam, if you obey me, my statutes and my commandments, then I will give you a sure house. Okay, so now we see the stage has been set. So now we have this clean break between Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Jeroboam up north, Rehoboam in the south. Now, I don't know if you could read this. I hope you can. Okay, yeah, it looks pretty good. All right. This is a sort of like a little, I hate to call it a cheat sheet, but it kind of is. It's kind of a little chart. It's a very short, concise chart, but it shows the case between these two, Israel and Judah. Israel up top, Judah at the bottom. And you look at it, it's broken up into nice little partitions of the relationship between these two kingdoms over the course of the next about 220 years. If you look at it, let's look at this just real quick. For the first part, for about 60 years, between Judah and Israel, there's antagonisms. There's fighting. There's wrestling for control. Israel would try to come and take a portion of Judah. Judah would fight them back and maybe take a little portion of Israel. That's why the maps that you find, they're good up to a certain point, because at any given time, at any given year, portion of Judah might belong to Israel. A portion of Israel might belong to Judah. The borders were changing because they were trying to take away property from one another, trying to take away land from one another. But for about 60 years, starting at 931, this is the breakup of the kingdom, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. In 931, there were antagonisms between Israel and Judah for about 60 years. In this case, it's from Jeroboam in the north to Omri, the king in the north. And in Judah, it was from Rehoboam through Asa in the south. That's for about 60 years. After that point, but after Asa and Omri, for about 75 years, that's not a lot of time in the course of this kingdom, but for 75 years at least, there were alliances between the two kingdoms for about 75 years. And from Ahab to Jehoahaz, and from Jehoshaphat to Joash in the south, from 874 and 873, for about 75 years, the relations between the two of them were often strained, but there was no real open conflict. You may have had some tribal issues at borders, but by and large, there was no declaration of war between the two. They would come to each other's defense if need be. A lot of this was political alliances through marriages and so forth and so on. But they realized this was a period of time when they realized sometimes against their own ideas or against their own consideration, that they were brethren. They were still brethren. You had 10 tribes up north and 2 tribes in the south, but they were still brethren. And that's important. That's important. God did not like it when they fought against one another. And he condemned it when one kingdom would do something to the other kingdom for whatever reason. He condemned it. He said, you people are brethren. You all came from the same man. You're all tribes of Jacob, and here you are behaving like this towards one another. And then after that 75-year period, it began to devolve again into antagonisms. And that lasted for about 75 years. In the north, the kings from 798 to 722, from Jehoash to Hoshea, which was the time that the northern kingdom was gone. And then from 796, from Amaziah to Ahaz in the southern kingdom. Yeah.
I'm sorry to do this.
No, that's okay.
I'm very rusty in this. I have written in my notes, obviously I went wrong. My understanding was that Rehoboam was made king after Solomon died. He was then made king of Israel. When he made some harsh laws, we're going to double down, make people work harder. Jeroboam comes on the scene.
Yes.
He speaks out in defiance against Rehoboam for doubling the workload.
Yes.
For the northern kingdom. Well, then he decides, Jeroboam does, to go south and splits off and starts the southern kingdom called Judah. But yet, you just said Rehoboam was king of the southern kingdom.
Yeah, Jeroboam does not go south. Jeroboam takes the 10 tribes to the north.
Okay, where do they go north?
It's within the borders of Israel.
Could go anywhere.
Yeah.
Just gather as the 10 tribes apart from Judah. But also comment, if I remember right, you correct me if I'm wrong, Brother Chuck, that God is the one that told to the prophet that Jeroboam would take the 10 tribes
Yes.
away.
Yes. That's why this council that they had was never going to produce any other result than the one that it produced. Because God knows the hearts of men. He knew that Rehoboam was going to reject their offer of camaraderie. He was never going to accept that offer. He knew it. And God had told Jeroboam that he was going to. Jeroboam was, I don't want to say it, so I'm not going to say it. At the end of the day, Jeroboam is in the exact place that God said that he was going to be. He had fled to Egypt. When he heard that Solomon was dead and that Rehoboam was going to be king, he comes up with his northern tribe that was his portion. He goes up and he goes with the people of Israel, and they go. Now at this point, I want to make sure that we understand at this point, and this is where it can kind of get difficult. When it says that Jeroboam and all Israel, it literally means that all of Israel was being taxed. All of Israel was suffering under the reign of Solomon. Everybody was being taxed heavy. Everybody was having to work, with the exception of the area surrounding Jerusalem and the temple. Solomon was very particular about that. Was almost sacred. So the people of the southern kingdom, because of their proximity to Jerusalem, believed that they were maybe a little superior to the rustic northern tribes. You might say that they were the rednecks in the eyes of Israel. It's like, oh, those hicks from the north, the country. We're the metropolitan Jerusalem with all of its proximity to the temple. So when Jeroboam goes with Israel, he's talking about the nation of Israel. They go, and then it says, okay, house of David, you're on your own. We're going, and they don't literally pick up and go anywhere. Jeroboam simply goes to the north part of Israel, the nation of Israel, and God separates those 10 tribes and gives them to Jeroboam, and Jeroboam reigns in the north of the kingdom, and Rehoboam is in the south of the kingdom. Does that make sense?
Yes, the only question I have now then is, why did Rehoboam go to the south if he remained king of Israel?
He didn't go south. He was always in the south, because that's Jerusalem is in the south of Israel.
Border of Israel and Judah.
Yeah, Rehoboam never had to go anywhere. He was a Jerusalem. He was a city kid, and he'd been a city kid from the time that he was born. He was with Solomon, his father, in Jerusalem. So again, this idea of being born into wealth and power, and he was an elite. And I believe he genuinely believed himself to be a superior person because of his royal lineage and his proximity to Jerusalem. all of the wealthy people that he considered his friends, he had a superiority complex.
Hey, Chuck,
Yes, sir.
you think about it too. You talked about the difference in the northern tribes and the way they saw things and the way the southern tribes did. But
Yes.
think about
Yes.
Jerusalem was where the money was, you know.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
like it's a lot like, you know, we think about big cities in our country, you know, downtown Atlanta, Washington, D.C., New York
Mhm.
City, you know, the what you call the metropolitan areas versus, you know, once you get outside of Atlanta and you head toward Macon, until you get to Macon, there's some nice sized cities there, but there's not near the power and the influence and the money
Yeah.
that you would find in downtown. So it's no different then, or it
Not
was
at
no
all.
different then than it is now. So.
And if you could, if you think about it this way, think about those people in those northern tribes and their distance from Jerusalem, but to see their taxes being carted off in wagons and on horses and whatever. Solomon's tax collectors come, they begin collecting taxes from everybody. And where did that tax money go? It wasn't spent in the northern tribes to make their life any better. It was all carted away where? Where did it go? Where did it end up?
Went right back to Jerusalem.
Exactly.
Went right into Solomon's coffers.
Solomon is becoming, and everybody knew Solomon was wealthy. It was evident that Solomon was wealthy. If you ever went to Jerusalem during the feast days and during the time of worship at the temple, you saw where all of your tax money was going. It's kind of like when you drive by a road project and nothing's being done on it, you think, why am I paying my taxes? Well, they realized where their tax money was going. It was going to Jerusalem and into Solomon's coffers. Now remember, this is God's judgment against the nation for desiring the king, because he said it was going to happen that way. They're still upset, and rightfully so. So they're up in northern Israel, and they have a legitimate complaint. It's nothing but legitimate. You know, and it says Solomon made our burden heavy. Now, there are scholars who believe that, well, they really didn't have much to complain about. Things were pretty good for them. I disagree. The scriptures tells us otherwise. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just trying to be funny.
Okay.
Okay, so is that any different than today hiring 87,000 more tax IRS guys?
Solomon would love that.
Where's that burden going? That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah. So Rehoboam would be loving that. You know, hey, listen, we can get more.
Hey, Chuck.
Yes.
You think about it too. You think about Solomon versus, let's go back to Joseph. It's exactly the opposite. Joseph did all that collecting, but he did it because he knew the famine was coming. Solomon was doing it for his own personal gain.
Right.
I mean, Joseph was doing it so that the people would survive and the nation would survive, because he had been told what God was going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Versus Solomon, who decided to take it upon himself, and I'm going to be the richest man around, and he proved that to be. So yeah, it's really amazing how you see the two in reverse.
You're correct. And you know, and we're not trying to put too fine a point on it. We need to remember that at the very beginning, God said this was going to happen. It was going to happen for a purpose. This is God's judgment. All of this is happening as God's judgment against Solomon. And sometimes, and this goes to show that sometimes we look at things and wonder, why is this happening like this? But we think that we know the mind of God, and we don't. Sometimes things happen. You think the average Israelite is wondering, you know, what's going on? And when they hear that the kingdom's been torn away and now they're part, well, I thought we were all Israelites. No, now you're an Israelite. That's Judah down there. Now we're Israel up here. Well, okay, now who's king? Well, Jeroboam. Okay. All right. Well, that's not a huge change. I think we can make it work. But there, as the old saying goes, but wait, there's more. Let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 11, because this is important. At the first part of that, it simply mirrors what was said earlier. Rehoboam decides to take this whole host, 180,000 men. We're going to restore the kingdom by force. Tell me how that would have worked. We're going to restore the kingdom by force. We're going to take all these men, and then we're going to occupy the northern kingdom. That's never going to happen. It's just not going to work. But let's go down a little bit further. Rehoboam goes back down. He returns back to Jerusalem. Rehoboam, at verse 5, he lives in Jerusalem. He built cities for defense in Judah. Who's he defending against? Northern kingdom. So he established these cities for defense. He builds Bethlehem, Etam, and he lists all of these cities that were used as defense against any incursions, both by Israel and by any of the nations that surrounding him all the way down through. So he establishes this ring of perimeter. And remember, God gives him the nation. God gives him Judah. God wants him. He establishes his kingdom, and he wants it to succeed if he'll simply do as he's told. But continuing on in verse 13, and the priests and the Levites who were all Israel presented themselves to him from all the places where they lived. For the Levites left their common lands and their holdings and came to Judah and Jerusalem, because Jeroboam and his sons cast them out from serving as priests of the Lord. And he appointed his own priests for the high places and for the goat idols and for the calves that he had made. What calves? What is he talking about here? What had Jeroboam done in regards to the worship of God? What had he done in that northern kingdom? No, he was scared. Remember, Jeroboam, he's got this kingdom and he's petrified. He's scared to death that the people who are in that northern kingdom, after they go down to Jerusalem to worship, they won't come back. If they leave and they go down, they're going to see the splendor of the temple. They're not going to want to give that up, and they will remain in Judah. And I'll lose by attrition. I'll lose my very best, my most religious. I'll lose all the upper, the very best and the brightest of my kingdom. I'll lose to Jerusalem, and I'll lose them to Rehoboam. So what does Jeroboam do? What does Jeroboam do in order to keep that from happening? Anybody know?
He built golden calves in Dan and Bethel at the north end and the south end, and so they could go there and worship instead of going back to Jerusalem as God wanted them to do.
Exactly. And at first, and this goes to show the wisdom of man is foolishness in the sight of God. Because Jeroboam, at the beginning, Jeroboam never had in mind that they would worship these golden calves as golden calves. They were merely a representation for Jehovah. So he sets these golden calves up for them to worship. They said, now what you'll do is you'll bow to these, but in doing so, you're really bowing to Jehovah. And that's not the case, is it? He's broken at least 2 commandments of the Lord. Shall not have any other gods, and you shall not make unto thee any graven images. So Jeroboam has already put his foot in it, hasn't he? So he makes these golden calves. As you said, he puts one up at Dan and one up at Bethel. And he says, if you, instead of going down to the temple, simply go to one of these 2 places and you can offer and you can sacrifice and you can worship the Lord there. All with this vain attempt to keep the people from this exodus out of Israel going back down to Judah. Now, was that wise? Absolutely not. It's foolishness. For one thing, it didn't stop anything. Number 2, he led the people into idolatry. Number 3, he broke 2 of the original 10 commandments simply by doing what he did. So every bit of it was a foolish, misguided attempt to maintain the status quo in the north, in Israel, the kingdom of Israel. So it was just an absolute mess that Jeroboam decides to do. Now, what happens in let's go, because is God turning a blind eye to this? Never has. So he's certainly not going to do this in the case of Jeroboam. Look at 1 Kings chapter 13. 1 Kings 13, at the very beginning. And behold, a man of God came out of Judah. So he comes up from the south by the word of the Lord to Bethel. So God sends this man to the north, to Bethel. What's in Bethel? A golden calf. What's happening there? Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make offerings. So Jeroboam is offering at a place that he was not authorized to make offerings and to sacrifice at. The man cried against the altar by the word of the Lord and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name. Now, this is one of those prophecies that's extremely specific. A lot of times prophecies, remember, were couched in, I don't want to say vague language, but it was language that could easily be misconstrued by people who weren't paying attention. But he says very specifically, there's going to be one born of the house of David, Josiah by name. Have we heard of Josiah? Is this a man that's lost to antiquity? No. I mean, the account is there. And he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you. And he gave a sign the same day. Remember, he says if a prophet of God makes a prophecy and it doesn't come to pass, then he's a false prophet. But what does it say here? He gave a sign the same day. So not only am I giving you an utterance from God, I'm going to give you a sign to show that this is from the Lord. He says, behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are on it shall be poured out. And when the king heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, seize him. And I don't know what Jeroboam thinks he's going to do. The word of the Lord is going to come forth, and he could rail against it, he can work against it all he can. But remember, if it's of God, nothing can be done. It's going to happen. So he says, seize him. And his hand, which he stretched out against him, dried up so that he could not draw it back to himself. I'm not exactly sure. I looked at this as much as I possibly could. It appears that his hand withered. I'm not sure about the idea that he couldn't draw it back to himself. Maybe it was stuck in that position and withered up. I'm not sure exactly what that means. But in any case, this was something that was unnatural. It was something that happened. It was a miraculous thing. And it happened specifically when the prophet said that it was going to happen. All right. The altar also was torn down, and the ashes poured out from the altar according to the sign that the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. And the king said to the man of God, entreat now the favor of the Lord your God, and pray for me that my hand may be restored to me. This is repentance. This is repentance. This is an act of repentance. Please take this away. I've made a grave error. And now I'm stuck like this. Entreat the Lord on my behalf. And the man of God entreated the Lord, and his king's hand was restored to him and became as it was before. And then look at this. The king says to the man, come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward. What was the reward for? Healing him. He was going to give him a reward for healing him from that withered hand. But what does the man of God say? I will not, if you give me half of your house. Now, the house here is not the physical dwelling. The house is your kingdom. If you gave me half of your kingdom, I will not go into you. And I will not eat bread or drink water in this place, for so it was commanded to me by the word of the Lord, saying not to eat bread or drink water, or return by the way that you came. So he went another way and did not return by the way that he came to Bethel. All right, so now, after Jeroboam has just received this kingdom, it is not long before he has already drawn the people away and led them into idolatry. Doesn't matter if they stood before these golden calves and said, well, it's a golden calf, but I'm actually worshiping Jehovah. That doesn't change the fact, does it? They are bowing themselves before a graven image that was made by the hands of men as an object of worship. It did not matter. Yes, sir.
To add to that, not only did he, shake the calves, if you will, he also chose the priests.
That was my next point. How did he? No. I appreciate you bringing that up. How did he do that? What were the words that the scriptures say about that?
It gave the impression that he selected from the people.
It said that anyone who wanted, essentially, it boils down to this: anyone who wanted to, who was bringing sacrifices and offerings, could be a priest.
Right.
What has he done now? He has rejected the royal or the God-given priests, because what had happened? All the Levites had gone south. That look, we're going back down in proximity to the temple. So there were no priests, there were no Levites. So the king began to designate priests who were not entitled to be priests from any tribe. It didn't matter who you were.
So I see that as him starting something anew. Nothing that he originated here came from God. Thus says the Lord.
That's right. It says, let's see, a second. I want to look at this. because there are three things.
We were talking about the calves, and then right up above that,
He changed the designation for the Feast of Tabernacles. He changed it from the seventh month to the 8th month. Or is it? I'm trying to remember if it's from the 8th month to the 7th month.
verse 30, is it?
Yes.
Or it might be a little earlier than that.
I'm trying to find it myself. I've got two screens going at once, and it's hell.
In verse 28, it says, whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said unto them, it
Yes.
is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold, thy God, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And he said, the one in Bethel and the other put he in Dan. And this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan.
Mm-hmm.
And he made houses of high places and made priests from among all the people that were not of the sons of Levi. And Jeroboam ordained a feast on the 8th day and on the 15th day of the month. In the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah. And he went up unto the altar, so that so did he in Bethel, sacrificing unto the calf that he had made. And he placed Bethel, the priest of the high place that he had made. That was pretty much the gist that I was getting there.
Yes.
That he appointed the priests, and they were from the common people, if you will, not the Levites. And then also the calves and the house that he erected, at the high places. All of these things were things that were not ordained or authorized by God.
If you look at verse 33, it actually alludes to exactly what you said. In the month that he had devised from his own heart.
Okay, yes.
You're absolutely right. Everything that he did because this was what he designed. Essentially, what Jeroboam is taking from this, what his understanding is now, he has carte blanche and a blank slate. So what is he going to do? He's going to devise everything new for himself. The priests are gone, the Levites are gone. So now I can designate priests from whoever. Now, some people who are maybe a little bit more charitable say, well, he had no choice, right? The Levites and the priests are gone. What would have been the prudent thing to do? To go and entreat the priests, come back. There's no animosity. We need you to come back, and we need you to serve here in Israel. Please teach the people. Please teach the people. Come back. We'll make sure that you're taken care of. And we want people to go down. See, this is prudent. And so far, if you look through the past 4 chapters, not one of these people has done any thinking that would be prudent. Not one prudent decision out of any of this. Every bit of this is, I'm substituting my will for the will of God. God said it's going to be done in this month. I'm going to do it in this month. God said this tribe is to be of the priests. I'm saying that any tribe can be the priest. God says that only in Jerusalem and in the temple is where you're supposed to offer up those sacrifices and worship. I'm going to allow you to sacrifice. I'll institute new places, temples. Notice it says temples, not temple. There's one temple. Because I'm going to make temples in those high places. So, and when he says high places, it's in the hills. It's in the hill country. But there's only one temple. But Jeroboam is saying, I have carte blanche and I have a blank slate to do whatever I want to. So I'm going to design for myself what I think would be the very best. But not one of these things is what God wanted. Remember the promise and threat that he made against Jeroboam. If you will obey my statutes and commandments. What are the statutes and commandments? You worship in the temple. The Levites are supposed to be the priests. These are the feast days. God instituted those feast days. Remember that. That wasn't something that the priest did. God instituted those days. On this day of this month, you will come and you will present yourself before the Lord. You will not sacrifice in the high places. You will sacrifice only here. All of these things were designated by God. Now Jeroboam has said, well, I'm going to do what Jeroboam's going to do what Jeroboam wants to do. So it is a catastrophe after catastrophe after catastrophe. and Jeroboam pays the price. Let's go down to hang on a second, let me find it. If you go to give me just a second. I think I got the wrong. Oh, okay. 1 Kings chapter 13. 1 Kings 13, and go to verse 33. After God had prophesied against that altar and had destroyed that altar where the ashes poured out, and he had withered Jeroboam's arm, even though the man of God allowed that to be healed, and his hand was made, or his arm was made clean again after retreating the Lord. Look what it says in verse 33. After this thing, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil ways, but made priests for the high places again among all the people. He did not learn his lesson. We'll stop here I promise we'll stop for a break. We get started. And this thing became sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and to destroy it from the face of the earth. So what's going to happen is, as God said, I will make of you a sure house because of his sin and his error. God says, I'm going to remove you. I will take you out of the way. Remember, in the southern kingdom, the house of David was going to remain on the throne. God said, I'll do the same thing for you, Jeroboam, if you'll obey. Jeroboam doesn't obey. And there, instead of having a long lineage of one family on the throne, as in the southern kingdom, and in the northern kingdom, it went back and forth at ping pong. You know, you'd have one group, have maybe 3 kings from one family, and then that family would be taken off the throne. There'd be another dynasty that would arise. Let's stop here, take our break, and then we'll get started back about 10 minutes.
Dave sent this out to everyone.
All right. We finished up chapter 13, speaking of Jeroboam. Jeroboam, in spite of everything, in spite of the prophecy against him, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way. The evil way was, of course, his corruption of the worship of Jehovah. He ordained priests from anybody who wanted to be a priest, and it became a sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off. And let's look at 1 Kings 14, because this is the prophecy against Jeroboam. Now, God had already made him a promise / I wouldn't say threat, but certainly a promise. You do this, and I'll establish you. But if you don't, then I'm going to cut you off. But here we see a prophecy, an actual prophecy specifically against Jeroboam in chapter 14. His child becomes sick. And one thing that you might want to look at, it says, look at it in verse 1, it says, at that time, Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, fell sick. Now, if you look at some of the names that we find in Kings and Chronicles, oftentimes you might see a name that's repeated. But if you look at the times in which those names are repeated, it could be as many as 60, 70, 100 years in between those names. You got to be a little careful about saying, well, I thought that guy had already been alive. Yes, but it's like me. My name is Charles. Guess what? There have been plenty of Charleses that have risen and died, and there's going to be plenty more after I'm gone. And I imagine if you look at the name Charles 200 years from now, you can reasonably assume it's not me. So when you look at these names, just make sure that the time frame that you're looking at is correct. So some of the names are repeated. And if you look at Abijah and Ahijah, right? So there's 2 words, Ahijan, Abijan. All of these names are different. Some of them are very similar. So just be careful when you're reading it. You're looking at the right name, and it means what it's supposed to mean. All right. So his son fell sick. He does not want to go to Ahijah. So his son Abijah is sick. He sends his wife to Ahijah, who is the prophet. He says, I want you to go to the prophet, and he's going to tell you. It's interesting. He still sees this man of God as one who speaks on behalf of God. So he says, I want you to take all these gifts, go to the prophet. The prophet will tell you what's going to happen to his son, to our son. So his wife did just that. She goes to Shiloh, comes to the prophet's house. And if you look at let's look at verse 6. When Ahijah heard the sound of her feet as she came in the door, he said, come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why do you pretend to be another? She was trying to disguise her identity. I'm charged with unbearable news for you. Go, tell Jeroboam, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. When this is uttered, you know for a fact it comes from God, and it's going to happen. It is inexorable. Because I exalted you from among the people and made you leader over my people Israel. So God acknowledges the northern tribes as his people, but he made Jeroboam king over them. He tore them away from Rehoboam. I made you leader over my people Israel. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. And yet you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart, doing only that which was right in my eyes. But you have done, look how he phrases this, but you have done evil above all who were before you, and have gone and made for yourself other gods and metal images, which are what? Golden calves, Dan and Bethel. You've done this. You know, J'Cuse, he's pointing his finger directly at Jeroboam, and he's recounting his sin. He's going to have an accounting for it. There's a reckoning coming. He said, you have done evil, you've made for yourself other gods and metal images, provoking me to anger, and have cast me behind your back. Therefore, behold, I will bring harm upon the house of Jeroboam, and will cut off from Jeroboam every male, both bond and free in Israel, and will burn up the house of Jeroboam as a man burns up dung until it is all gone. Goes on, anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies in the city, the dogs shall eat. And anyone who dies in the open country, the birds of the heavens shall eat, for the Lord has spoken it. Moreover, in verse 14, moreover, the Lord will raise up for himself a king over Israel, who shall cut off the house of Jeroboam today. And henceforth the Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water, and root up Israel out of this good land that he gave to their fathers, and scatter them beyond the Euphrates, because they have made their Asherim, provoking the Lord to anger. So there's a couple of things to unpack here, right? Number one, who's the cause of all of this? It's Jeroboam. It's Jeroboam. Not only did he sin, he caused the nation to sin. He rejected God's commandment to him. You shall keep my statutes and my commandments. He has made false gods for the people, even though he claims that they are Jehovah. Well, look what he says. He says, behold, these, the God that took you out, that brought you up out of Egypt. So he's equating Jehovah God with these golden calves, an abomination. He says, in spite of that, in spite of everything that I promised you, you have not done what I told you to do. He says, I will bring harm and I will cut off from Jeroboam. And anyone who dies in the city, the dogs are going to eat. Anyone who dies in the open country, the birds are going to eat. This is, we think, well, that's not much of a threat. I mean, at the end of the day, if you die, you die. And what does it really matter? It is very important. It was very important for the Israelites to gather their deceased loved one and to mourn over them and to bury them in the tombs of their father. This was adding insult to injury. But this is how angry God is with the situation. He is furious with this situation. I want to look more, most especially at verse 14. He says, and henceforth the Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water and root them up out of this good land. So not only is he talking about simply the end of Jeroboam's reign on the throne of Israel, but he's also talking about the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, and he alludes to what's going to happen in the not too distant future, doesn't he? What happens to Israel? What happens to Israel after the end of that? What happens in the northern kingdom after that last king in the northern kingdom? What happens to them?
They're taken into Assyrian captivity.
The Assyrians come down. The Assyrians who had been in decline come roaring back because now they are an arm of God. They come in and they smite the northern kingdom. They take it away from them. They carry off the northern kingdom into captivity. Exactly what he says, I will root them up out of this land. Much in the same way as he promised the Israelites, the Hebrews, as they were going into the land of Canaan. If you do not abide in my statutes and my commandments, I will drive you out of the land as I drove out the Canaanites before you. Is God's promise always sure? Yes. Is God slack, as some men count slackness concerning his promise? No, absolutely not. If he makes a promise, that's what's going to happen. They did exactly what he told them not to do, and he's exacting his judgment on them, both in the immediate sense on Jeroboam and on the nation. Because remember, simply because Jeroboam enticed them to sin, did they have a choice in the matter? They absolutely did. That's why and you may have seen this happen where you have a congregation And the elders decide against the word of God that they're going to institute things in that congregation that they should not do. And the people say, well, what are you supposed to do about it? Well, what do you expect us to do? They what's that? Exactly. Sometimes people need just a little bit of encouragement to do the right thing rather than the wrong thing. And elders are men. What's that? So, exactly right. So the people simply could have said, we will not worship at these false gods. We will not bow down to these calves. Well, they didn't. And God is not only going to judge Jeroboam, he's also going to judge the nation of Israel, that northern kingdom. And he says he's going to shake them. And truthfully, while the southern kingdom enjoyed periods of prosperity and strength and consistency, the northern kingdom never really regained its footing after Jeroboam because of those false gods. How many kings of the northern kingdom were good in the sight of the Lord, did good in the sight of the Lord? How many out of all of the kings did good in the sight of the Lord?
None.
Zero. Big goose egg. They were batting 0 for 17, I think. I'm trying to remember how many kings. It doesn't matter. We're going to get into it. They batted 0. Not one of the kings was good. The nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, continued to offer up sacrifices at those false gods, and God never allowed them to be established the way Judah, with the good kings that came from Judah, he never allowed them to be established in the same way. He shook them, right, as a reed in the water. And he rooted them out and he scattered them beyond the Euphrates. Verse 17, Jeroboam's wife arose, came back, told them exactly what the prophet had said. Verse 19, now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he warred and how he reigned, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings. And the time that Jeroboam reigned was 22 years, and he slept with his fathers, and Nadab, his son, reigned in his place. Now, while this is all going on, Rehoboam's reign was significantly longer than Jeroboam's. Now, Rehoboam reigned in Judah. He was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city that the Lord had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, put his name there. Judah did, in verse 22, Judah was not doing much better, were they? Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins. Now let's look at the sins of the southern kingdom, Judah. For they also, verse 23, built for themselves high places and pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also, and this gets into an abomination before the Lord. There were also male cult prostitutes in the land. They did according to all the abominations of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. So that land that was just given to sin before God came and drove the Canaanites out has gone right back into sin. There's this brief shining moment during the time of David where the good things were done, the right things were done, and now they've gone back into the sin. This all goes back, remember, to the people. They did not drive out the people that had those that were practicing that sin. They allowed them to remain. They married their children, and it infected that nation. And they just were never able to truly get shut out of it until a little bit later on, because we see where there's a reckoning that comes through a couple of kings where the bad things are truly driven out. Not simply, well, we just won't do that anymore. The pillars are torn down. The temples of the false gods are destroyed. And we'll see that here, before too long.
A little laughter. Looking at Jeroboam and as far as his reign in the northern kingdom, then we said that he, had the houses or temples that he built in high places, that he appointed priests. And we were saying, as far as logically thinking, he should have, approached, say, Rehoboam's kingdom, asking for priests, or requesting they come back.
Mm-hmm.
With Rehoboam and his, failures there, do that give Jeroboam an out? No, it doesn't.
No, the one of the things that we are given to understand, and the Lord brings this to a head, with the confrontation with the priests of Baal. He said, remember, in spite of all of the negativity, in spite of all of the what seems like a hopeless situation, he said, remember, there's always a remnant of people who have not bowed the knee.
Right.
And that needs to buoy us sometimes. Sometimes we think, is it just me? Is it me alone? Am I the only one left? And as the prophet understood, God told him, he said, no, I've reserved for myself so many who have not bowed the knee. They will not do it. You don't know where they are, or else I wouldn't have to tell you about this. But there are those who have not done it. They still remain faithful.
Yeah.
So there were priests who were, you can imagine, the king has this outsized influence over the nation, but there were still priests who still clung to the word of the Lord and did not do as they were being enticed to do by the nation that surrounded them. And you can imagine it was probably a very lonely existence for the priesthood, because here they are surrounded by evil. Everywhere they look, there's a pillar, and there's a shrine, and there's a temple or an altar to all of these false gods. And you can imagine that was probably a very lonely existence. And before too long, especially in the northern kingdom, even when there were faithful people, they feared for their lives. We know that the prophets certainly did as they went up to prophesy. They feared for their lives. But faithfulness overcame it all, right? The whole point is to remain faithful even in the face of all of that. All right. So what did God do to Rehoboam in the south? In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, in verse 25, in 1 Kings 14, verse 25, in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. Now, who was Shishak? Remember, where did Jeroboam go to hide from Rehoboam? He went to the nation of Egypt, and who was the king at that time? Shishak. Okay, so King Shishak of Egypt came up against Jerusalem. Was this on his own account? No, God is punishing Rehoboam for his idolatrous ways and leading the country in idolatry. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the shields of gold that Solomon had made. And King Rehoboam made in their place shields of bronze. Now that's a big step down, isn't it? Big step down from gold to bronze. It's kind of like a diamond versus cubic zirconia. Okay, big difference. Shishak carried away everything. And I think this is a telling thing. All of that treasure in the temple in Jerusalem. How did God count that treasure that was in Jerusalem and in the temple? Did that mean anything to him? What does God take pleasure in? A contrite, penitent, faithful heart. God didn't give a care for all of that gold in the temple, all of that gold in Jerusalem. That didn't mean anything to him. What he wanted was obedience from the people, and he'd rather have that than anything else.
Hey, Chuck.
Yes, sir.
So by verse 26, the Ark of the Covenant was carried off as well, correct?
Yes, the treasures of the house of the Lord. Everything. I mean, it says that very specifically. Yeah. The treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king's house, he took away everything. Anything that was of any value, he removed it. So here's this beautiful temple of the Lord, gold plated, and now it's empty. It's bereft of treasure. And God allowed it to happen. He caused it to happen for that very reason, to humble these people. He allowed everything to be carried away. And now here they are, the beautiful house of the Lord with nothing in it. And if you think about it, when he says they carried away everything that would have been in use to offer up sacrifice to the Lord. All the flesh hooks, all of the fire pans, all of the urns, all of the water pitchers, everything that Solomon had taken such great pains to make for the Lord and to dedicate to the service of the Lord, it was all carried away by this Egyptian king that had given protection to his enemy, Solomon's enemy. So this is a giant slap in the face to Rehoboam. But had Rehoboam done what he was supposed to do, it wouldn't have happened. Now, the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? And there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. Remember, we're still in the middle of the antagonisms. That's what's going on now. Rehoboam slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. And Abijam, his son, reigned in his place. All right, so now we've gotten this division, right? And the kingdoms never came back together. There was never a time when it was again a unified kingdom until the captives came back from King Cyrus. He allowed them to come back, but even then, it would have been very difficult to make peace with a northern kingdom that was no longer there. So this was a breaking point, a fissure that was never able to be reconciled. All right. So,
what years were those, Chuck? That 60-year period. I think we have that.
from 931.
Yep.
From 931 to 874, around about. Again, the dates are, it's close enough for government work.
Right. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Okay, so let's see here. So we've got. All right, so we got Jeroboam. Jeroboam has finished up his reign. God has weighed him in the scales, and he was found wanting. Jeroboam has passed away in the northern kingdom, and his son has reigned in his place. His son was. Trying to remember all of these. Nadab. Nadab reigns in Israel. Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, and 1 Kings 15, verse 25. Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, began to reign over Israel in the second year of Asa, king of Judah. So Rehoboam is passed in the southern kingdom. But Nadab begins to reign over Israel in the second year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigns over Israel 2 years. 2 years. Not very long, and for good reason. All right, there's a reason behind it. Why is that? We find it in verse 26. First Kings 15, verse 26. Somebody read that for me.
He did evil, of course. He did evil in the sight of God and walked in the way of his father and in his sin, which he had made Israel sin.
Okay.
Of course, we could have all said that, right? He followed in his dad's footsteps.
And again, this is the common thread that runs all the way through the northern kingdom. There's not one king where he said, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. That's the defining feature of that northern kingdom, is every single one of them did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and caused Israel to sin in the sight of the Lord. Again, that's that outside influence on the nation. And to see, if they didn't have those physical kings, if they simply allowed God to be their monarch, which was the plan from the beginning, that wouldn't be the problem, because God is always going to cause us to do what? He's always going to cause us to do the right. He's always, that's his nature, and he can't go against his nature. God will always I wouldn't say cause us, because that implies an outside where he's going to direct us like puppets. That's not the case. But God is always going to influence us to do what's right. But the physical kings, these evil men, not only sinned themselves, but they caused Israel to sin. Why? Because they maintained those temples and the shrines and the altars and the golden calves and all those. And before too long, those golden calves are going to be crowded out by every other false god that could possibly come down the pike.
It's amazing to me that no king in Israel was righteous, and yet Israel is spoken of today as God's continued chosen people.
Again, that's the wisdom of man. That's the wisdom. That's man's wisdom right there. And it's a profound misunderstanding of Scripture and misinterpretation. Sometimes just an outright, I want to prove a point, so I'm going to interpret the Scripture this way. But God did not. The point of the people the point of the people of God was what? To provide a pathway for the Messiah. He didn't simply make them his people to make them his people. He did that so that what? The nations of the earth could be blessed. The people are going to sin, and he allowed them to sin. He allowed them to be carried away, much in the same way he allowed that treasure out of Jerusalem in the temple. And that meant nothing to him. Gold doesn't mean anything to God. He put it in the ground. He could take it out. He allows somebody else to have it. He does not care. But let's look at verse 27. Nadab is reigning in Israel. Baasha, the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar, conspired against Nadab. For Nadab and all Israel were laying siege to Gibbethon. So Baasha killed him in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his place. And as soon as he was king, he killed all of the house of Jeroboam. Hold on now. That sounds familiar. What was the word of the prophet against Jeroboam? He was going to raise someone up who was going to destroy the house of Jeroboam. As God had said that I will establish your house, but if you do the right thing. Now he says, because you haven't done the right thing, I will have your house will be destroyed. It will no longer sit on the throne. She had this great opportunity. He had a country that had he maintained his integrity and done the right thing, he would have had a son on the throne. His throne would have been established. And truthfully, knowing what we know about the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom could have even been that great shining beacon of light. If he had allowed the people to go down and worship, if he had kept his integrity, if he had obeyed the statutes and the commandments, his throne would have been assured. His family would have been assured. And it would have been spoken of in glowing terms, but that's not what happened. So now this man, Baasha, conspired against him, and he struck him down and killed Nadab, and not only killed Nadab, but killed all of the house of Jeroboam. He left to the house of Jeroboam not one that breathed until he had destroyed it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. It was for the sins of Jeroboam that he sinned, and that he made Israel to sin, and because of the anger to which he provoked the Lord, the God of Israel. And in verse 31, now the rest of the acts are, don't you find those in the book of Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? And there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. So right now, we've already gone through a couple of kings in Israel, and again, we're still in the middle of all of these antagonisms. For 60 years, there was just this constant fighting between the two of them.
Asia and Baasha, yeah.
So in the 3rd year of Asa, the king of Judah, Baasha, the king of the son of Ahijah, began to reign over all Israel, and he reigned 24 years. I bet you can't guess what comes after this. What did he do in the sight of the Lord? He did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the ways of Jeroboam and in his sin, which he made Israel to sin. This is another thing we will find as we go through in the account of the northern kingdom. You'll find this repeated over and over again, that he continued in the sin of Jeroboam. Jeroboam. That sin was never taken away from Jeroboam. It was always attributed to him. The original sin of bringing in those golden calves laid squarely at the feet of Jeroboam, and that was never going to be removed from him. He was always going to be known for that. All right. Let's see. I want to go a little bit further.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Was it Nadab who reigned for 2 years and sinned?
Yes, sir.
And died?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
And the Baasha came in after Nadab.
Thank
you. Mm-hmm.
So all this took place between 931 and 874.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to go, let's go to 2 Chronicles 13, because we've been talking about the northern kingdom, but now let's go down, let's look at the southern kingdom. And you'll find that Chronicles details a lot more about the southern kingdom than the northern kingdom. That was for the book of Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings deal with both. Chronicles deals mostly with the southern kingdom. Let's look at chapter 13 and verse 1. In the 18th year of King Jeroboam, so now Jeroboam is still on the throne, Abijah, who was the son of Rehoboam, next in line for the throne, Abijah began to reign over Judah, the southern kingdom. He reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. And there was war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Remember, Jeroboam's still in that northern kingdom. There's war between Abijah and Jeroboam, the antagonisms. Now, I'm not going to read the entire passage here, but if you look at the last part of verse 2, all the way down through verse 12, Abijah goes out to battle, and he has this army, and it says, army of valiant men of war, 400,000 chosen men. Jeroboam drew up his line of battle against him with 800,000 chosen mighty warriors. So now you have Abijah from the southern kingdom, Jeroboam, and they're meeting somewhere around the border between the two. There's always this issue with the border. This belongs to us. We're going to take a little bit of this. No, we're going to drive you out. And there was this jockeying for position right there at the border between the kingdoms. So Jeroboam stands there with 800,000, and Abijah stands there with 400,000. Now, if you simply look at this from a number standpoint, Abijah is behind the 8 ball, isn't he? It's going to be tough. Unless your men are just incredibly superior warriors or have a mechanical or a tactical advantage or a mechanical advantage as far as weaponry is concerned, it's going to be difficult for 400,000 to beat 800,000. However, what do we know about God in numbers? God does not care. God's word is always going to come to fruition. If God wants an enemy destroyed, it doesn't matter, right? That's exactly where I was going. Great point. Look at Gideon. God said, you still got too many. Send some of them home. Okay, when anybody wants to go home, going home. Hey, man, I got a wife and kids. I'm going to go home. So they go home. Now you still got too many. So he winnows it down to this small amount. And you can imagine from a human standpoint, the other soldiers are saying, hold on, the enemy has how many? And I mean, I'm counting 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I thought I heard somebody. Sorry. So here's Gideon, but what was Gideon's belief? God can accomplish anything he wants to accomplish. The same thing happens here. Look at what he says. He calls out to him. He says, hear me, O Jeroboam and all Israel. Ought you not to know that the Lord God of Israel gave the kingship over Israel forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt? Interesting turn of phrase, the idea of a covenant of salt. Salt being a preservative. In other words, this is a covenant that is not going to be overthrown. A covenant that it's resolute. It's not going to change. It's going to remain in place, much like the covenant that God made with Abraham. It's like the covenant that God made with Israel through the law coming from Moses. God's covenants are assured unless, as we spoke, I think last week, unless someone violates that covenant, God's covenants are assured. He says he gave it to him by a covenant of salt. Yet Jeroboam, speaking of the man that he's looking at, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, a servant of Solomon, the son of David, rose up and rebelled against his Lord. And certain worthless scoundrels gathered about him and defied Rehoboam, son of Solomon, my father. When Rehoboam was young and irresolute, it could not withstand them. He's kind of, I wouldn't say revisionist, but he's certainly painting a better picture of Rehoboam than Rehoboam deserves. Rehoboam absolutely could have withstood them. He just simply chose not to. He could have gone with those older, wiser men. He simply didn't. But anyway, he's engaging in this diatribe against King Jeroboam. He said, and now you think to withstand the kingdom of the Lord in the hands of the sons of David because you have a great multitude, and you have with you the golden calves that Jeroboam made for you for God. And it could be, I take this to mean that Jeroboam, when he would go out to battle, he would bring these golden calves, much in the same way that the Israelites would bring the Ark of the Covenant. Hey, go get the Ark. The Ark will protect us. Well, not unless God's with it. If God is not there, then it's just a box. Because they tried that with the Philistines. And what happened with the Philistines? They took the Ark. They just said, okay, we'll just take that from you. We'll take it back to our hometown. The Ark of the Covenant is not to be used as a weapon. It doesn't bestow upon you magic powers. He says, you think to come against us with this and with your golden calves? He continues on. Have you not driven out the priests of the Lord, the sons of Aaron, and the Levites, and made priests for yourselves like the peoples of other lands? In other words, anybody wants to, if you pay enough, or if you give enough, or if you give a favor to the king, that he'll make you a priest. He said, we have the priests. We have the priests, the Levites. You drove them out. They came to us, and you think that you can do whatever you want to do. But as for, I'm sorry, whoever comes for ordination with a young bull or 7 rams becomes a priest of what are not gods. At this point, Abijah, in the words of the kids, is spitting straight truth. Absolutely. He's saying exactly what it is. You have the numbers and you have these golden calves and you do whatever you want to do. You don't understand who you come up against. God has established the kingdom of David. He has put a man on the throne. It will not be taken away. What do you think you're going to accomplish here? But as for us, the Lord is our God, and we have not forsaken him. We have priests ministering to the Lord who are sons of Aaron and Levites for their service. They offer the Lord every morning and every evening, and they set out the showbread, and they care for the golden lampstands. For we keep the charge of the Lord our God, but you have forsaken him. Behold, God is with us at our head, and his priests with their battle trumpets to sound the call to battle against you, O sons of Israel. Do not fight against the Lord, the God of your fathers, for you cannot succeed. They have a point. Remember, if it's from God, it cannot be defeated. If it's from man, then there's nothing that it's going to fall apart on its own. And God said, I made a covenant, and it's not going to go away. So Abijah is absolutely correct in what he's saying here. Jeroboam had set an ambush around, and his troops were in front of Judah, and the ambush was behind them. Judah looks, and behold, the battle is in front of them, behind them. They cried to the Lord. The priests blew the trumpets. Men of Judah raised the battle shouts. Interesting. They don't run, do they? They're not in retreat. It's, hey, the Lord is on our side. The battle is assured. We're going to fight. When the men of Judah shouted, God defeated Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. The men of Israel fled before Judah, and God gave them into their hand. They struck them with great force. There fell slain of Israel 500,000 chosen men. So this 800,000 choice men of valor, fighting men of the army. Out of that 800,000, 500,000 of them fell to the men of Judah, because God was fighting their battles. They beseeched the Lord. The Lord fought on their behalf, and it says that the Lord struck down, not the men of Judah. God struck them down. Thus the men of Israel were subdued at that time, and the men of Judah prevailed because they relied on the Lord, the God of their fathers. Man, if there's that'll preach. How many instances do we find from the time of the Hebrews going into going up against out of Egypt towards the promised land to this point? How many times has God prevailed on their behalf because they beseeched the Lord rather than relying on their own? And every time they've relied on themselves, God saw to it that they were defeated. Just an incredible lesson, and it's never changed. Even today, if we call upon the name of the Lord, what's going to happen? We're going to prevail. It does not mean we're always going to win every battle in this lifetime. That's not what he's saying. That's not what he's saying at all. But God will fight our battles for us if we will call on his name with a faithful heart. And this is exactly what he does. So Abijah pursued Jeroboam and took cities from him, Bethel and Jeshanah. And Jeroboam did not recover his power in the days of Abijah. And the Lord struck him down and he died. But Abijah grew mighty, and he took 14 wives and had 22 sons and 16 daughters. The rest of the acts of Abijah, his ways and his sayings, are written in the story of the prophet. I don't know if that's Edo or Ido. I did not look that up. But it goes to show that there are a lot of names that kind of come out in these accounts that we don't hear about any other way. So here's this man, this prophet, Edo or Ido, that we don't hear about before, and we don't hear about it afterward, but there's a prophet there that was speaking on behalf of the word of the Lord. All right. All right, let's continue on. We go a little bit further. We'll stop a little early if we don't take I'll tell you what, though. Not to be indelicate, but we're going to take
a 5-minute recess. Just real quick.
Sorry about that. My doctor said to drink more water, but he didn't give me a hall pass. All right. So what do we know of Abijah? We know that when he goes up against King Jeroboam, that the words that are proceeding from his mouth are certainly righteous. He says all of the right things. Now let's go to 1 Kings 15, And we'll read a little bit more, because if we look at this, we could reasonably assume that Abijah was a godly king, one who did the right thing and was faithful before the Lord. But we find a different story in chapter 15 of 1 Kings. And this iterates the beginning of Abijah's reign. And now in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, so Rehoboam has died, Jeroboam is still on the throne in the northern kingdom. Rehoboam dies, and his son Abijah begins to reign over Judah. He reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem, and he walked, in verse 3, and this really tells us the end of it. He walked in all of the sins that his father did before him, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. So even though at the beginning, now here's two ways we can look at this. Two ways that we can look at this. And both of them have their points, have valid points. Number one, we can look at the words of Abijah, and that his words were righteous, but maybe his heart was not. His heart was inclined towards evil, but as he goes up before Jeroboam, he puts on the air of righteousness and indignation at Jeroboam coming down and behaving abominably up in the northern kingdom, and he's calling Jeroboam down. Or we can look at it as was the case in Solomon, that at the beginning of his reign, Abijah was a faithful man of God, and then over that 3 years, not a long period of time, but over those 3 years, that his heart was inclined more and more inclined towards evil. He gave into those sinful acts and practices. Again, both of those have valid points behind it, but at the end of the day, what it boils down to is what's written about him, and that is that he walked in all of the sins that his father did before him. So he did not drive out the cult prostitutes. He did not tear down the false gods and the pillars and the Asherim and tear down all of the shrines and the temples and all of those groves. And he did not do any of that. He walked in the evil of Rehoboam, his father. All right. But in verse 4, and this is important because God remembers his promise. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the promise that God made to David, he gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, setting up his son after him and establishing Jerusalem, because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Except he did not turn aside from anything that he commanded him, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. That's still being brought. That sin followed him for the rest of his days, and even into the case of the accounts of the kings. Now there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of his life. The rest of the acts of Abijah and all they did, are they not written in the books of Chronicles? And they certainly were. There was war between Abijah and Jeroboam, and Abijah slept with his fathers. He died, and they buried him in the city of David, and Asa, his son, reigned in his place. Again, God, that idea of a lamp, he established his son in his place. Now, what do we know about Asa? Well, verse 9. In the 20th year of Jeroboam's still on the throne in the northern kingdom, Asa began to reign over Judah, and he reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. This is the important thing in verse 11. It all boils down to this. Anything that we might hope to accomplish, it all boils down to what this says. If you think about it, our lives are going to be summed up when we stand before the Lord. It's going to be summed up in one thing, or one of two ways, isn't it? Either enter in, good and faithful servant, or depart from me, I know you not. Well, look at the way that the kings are summed up in the books of Kings and Chronicles. Verse 11, and Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as David his father had done. He put away the male cult prostitutes out of the land and removed all the idols that his father had made. And this shows, the next verse shows he even took a very difficult step, didn't he? Look what he says in verse 13. He also removed Maacah, his mother, from being queen mother, because she had made an abominable image for Asherah. And Asa cut down her image and burned it at the brook Kidron. Brook Kidron has a significance that we're going to see as we go a little bit further on. But the high places were not taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly true to the Lord all his days. And he brought into the house of the Lord the sacred gifts of his father, and his own sacred gifts, silver and gold and vessels. So as he was receiving tribute, as he was receiving all of these gifts, he was bringing them to the house of the Lord. This shows a heart of a man who truly desired to serve God. So far in the southern kingdom, how many good kings have we had so far? One. Rehoboam began, Okay, but devolved and he became sinful. Abijah, his son, became sinful. Asa is the first good king that we have in the southern kingdom. Still no good ones in the northern kingdom, but one good one in the southern one. Yes, sir.
I'm noticing in my reading, and it could just be my translation, but I'm looking at, Abijah, or Abijam, or however you want to call
Right.
it. They're interchangeable here. In First King, in my reading, as far as, I have American Standard Version, and it says Abijam, Abijam.
Okay.
In Second Chronicles, looking at the 13th chapter there that we were reading there,
Right.
it says Abijah, Jah.
Correct. Yes.
So we need to take note of that to make sure that we're talking about the same person.
Exactly. And that's what we said earlier. If you're reading and you look at these names, make sure they correspond, because sometimes they will repeat them, but they'll be 200 years in the future. They can't be the same person. But if you look at this, it makes it very clear. Abijah, the people that we find in Second Chronicles 13, and the one we find in First Kings chapter 15, they're the same person because they correspond. The father's the same, the son's the same, and the amount of time they spend on the throne is the same. So you just got to make sure that you account for that. That's one of the tricky parts, and that's why so many scholars have issues in the past. Is this the same person? Is this just simply a different spelling of the same person from Northern King? Sometimes you'll have somebody in the north, and they'll talk about somebody in the north and somebody in the south at the same time, and the names are very similar, but they're not exact. You just have to be very careful. Yeah, and it can be challenging. I think that's maybe one of the reasons, because of the names and the fact that it goes back and forth. That's one reason a lot of people really don't put a lot of time into Kings and Chronicles. It's just too many names, too many dates, too many things going on. They hit the highlights like Elijah and Elisha, Ahab and Jezebel. Man, hit those highlights. Jehoshaphat and Josiah. We hit those, but there are lessons to be learned, even the kings that reigned for just a short period of time. There are lessons to be learned. So we can't just disregard it because it may be a little difficult, but we do keep an eye on who we're talking about. Go back and forth. That's why I've got a window open for First Kings and Second Chronicles. So you go back and forth. One thing I do like about this. All right.
Chuck?
So did I hear somebody?
Yeah, I was just going to say,
Yeah.
they have different names, but Asa was still the son, so that tells you that it was the same person.
Makes it very clear. The father was the same and the son was the same. So we know that however it was written from one to the other, we know that it was. Remember, also you have two different people writing these, right? You have Ezra and Nehemiah. Both of them. We have two different men writing these accounts. So you have that to contend with as well. But at the end of the day, if they're the same, then they're the same. It makes no difference as long as we know they're the same person. All right. Let's see. Let's go to Second Chronicles chapter 14. Second Chronicles 14. Abijah slept with his fathers. This is simply a recounting of what's going on in First Kings. But Abijah slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David. Asa, his son, reigned in his place. And in his days, this is one of the things, and I believe that this is one of God's rewards for doing the right thing. In his days, the land had rest for 10 years. And what that means is there weren't any wars. There weren't any major conflicts. God was rewarding his righteousness, his desire to be faithful. He was rewarding him by not allowing the enemies of Judah to come up against him. And that would have included the Ethiopians. It would have included the Egyptians and several other nations that would have loved to come in and do exactly what the king of Egypt had done, come up in and sack Jerusalem. But God gives them rest from that. He did what was good and right. We already verse 3 we've already alluded to in First Kings, but look at what it says in verse 4. Commanded Judah to seek the Lord. Now this is important because we've seen the outside influence of the kings up until this point. What has been their influence for the people? It's been to what? To sin. That's been the influence of the kings. They led their respective nations to sin. But what does Asa do? This good king do? He commands Judah to do what? Seek the Lord. In spite of the fact that his father and his grandfather didn't, he's telling people to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to keep the law and the commandments. If they had been doing that, they wouldn't have had the problems that they've had up until this point. If they'd been doing that, the kingdom wouldn't have been split. But they weren't doing that. But now he's telling them to come back, kind of like one of the early restoration movements, right? You've gone this far. I'm taking away some of the things that have been enticing you. Now seek the Lord and his commandments. He also took out of the city of Judah the high places and the incense altars, and the kingdom had rest under him. Now, during this period of rest, he didn't just sit idle, did he? Like Solomon. Remember, what did Solomon do because he had no wars? What was it say? What's the old proverb? Idle hands or what? Devil's workshop. But Asa took that period of time to do something productive. He built fortified cities in Judah, for the land had rest. He had no war in those years, for the Lord gave him peace. And he said to Judah, let us build these cities and surround them with walls and towers and gates and bars. The land is still ours because, and this is absolutely true, the land is still ours because we have sought the Lord our God. We have sought him and he has given us peace on every side. So they built and they prospered. And Asa had an army of 300,000 from Judah, armed with large shields and spears, and 280,000 men from Benjamin that carried shields and drew bows. All these were mighty men of valor. So like his father went up against Jeroboam with 400,000 against 800,000, the Lord gave the land into his hand. He had a period of rest, and in doing so, allowed him to rebuild what had been lost under his father and under his grandfather. So now he's got these fortified cities to protect against encroachments. He's got this standing army that are. This is a point of contention because there are some who believe that the army was a standing army. That's all they did. And then there are others who believe that this was an army of they would press them into service when the need arose. Doesn't matter. He had the men that, if necessary, if there was a problem, he would be able to address it, especially since he called on the name of the Lord. But look what happens. In verse 8, Zerah the Ethiopian came up out of against them with an army of 1,000,000 men. Now let's add this up. Asa had an army of 300,000 from Judah and 280,000 men from Benjamin. So that's what? 580,000, almost 600,000. Here's Zerah the Ethiopian with 1,000,000 men and 300 chariots. Asa went out to meet him, and they drew up their lines of battle in the valley of Zephathah at Marashah. Now we're going to go into all of this, but look what he says in verse 11. What did he seek after? The Lord. He cries out to who? Not the false idols. He cried out to the Lord his God. O Lord, there is none like you to help between the mighty and the weak. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come up against this multitude. O Lord, you are our God. Let not man prevail against you. That's the kind of thing that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. That's you talk about faith. He's coming out with fewer. And he's looking at this million. You can imagine that. What does 1,000,000 men in combat look like? I can't even conceive of those kind of numbers. That's enormous. And they're all coming up out of the south. They're approaching. They get pretty close to him. And here he goes out with these 580,000 men. And what does he do? He doesn't turn tail and run. He doesn't capitulate. He doesn't seek terms of peace. It would have been understandable if you had been a soldier and say, okay, when is he going to go out and try to persuade these guys to turn around and go home? Maybe we'll just give them something and let them go home. Well, that had happened before. What happens? God had given Rehoboam into the hand of the Egyptians. Maybe this is going to be like this again. Well, what does he do? Lord, this is on you. You can do this. We trust in you. So what happens? So the Lord defeated the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. Now, I don't know how this happens. A lot of times it says that God defeated their enemy, but it doesn't say how. Did he simply give them strength and power and ability to go and do that for them? Did he cause some miraculous thing to happen to the Ethiopians? It doesn't matter, but we know that God fought their battles for them, as he had done from the very beginning. If they sought him, God fought their battles. So he pursued, the Lord defeats them. Asa and the people who were with him pursued them as far as Gerar, and the Ethiopians fell until none remained alive. I want you to think about that. He defeated them where they were, and then as they fled, God continued to defeat them and continued to defeat them until not one man of a 1,000,000-man army survived. Not one of them made it back to his hometown. I want you to think about what 1,000,000 people to die. That is staggering. The amount of destruction that God must have wrought. And you think about this as well. What did this do to the nation of Ethiopia? When you take a million men of age, you take that out of the population and they don't go back in there. What does that do to a nation? I'll give you. I'll tell you this. I saw this statistic the other day, and I'm going to butcher the statistic. I just hope you get the gist of it. I read somewhere that after World War I, the population of Great Britain did not recover until almost into World War II. The population didn't, because you've taken all of these young men who would have gotten married and had children, and you've removed them from the population through death in the war. And how long it took for their population to be rebuilt. And that wasn't near 1 million. Wasn't close to 1 million. They didn't lose that many men in World War I. So you think about this nation of Ethiopia and their arrogance and thinking they can come up against Jehovah God. And then God takes 1 million men out of their population. How long was it before Ethiopia began to realize a population again? All of these, all the women that were there, what happens? Because now their nations that surround them, hey, all of their men are gone. They're ripe for the picking. So God smote them in more than one way. But it was all because Asa said, we're going to call on the name of the Lord and not rely on ourselves. Just a fantastic lesson. All right. The men of Judah carried away very much spoil. They attacked all the cities around Gerar, for the fear of the Lord was upon them. Hey, we're going to strike while the iron's hot, right? They plundered all the cities, for there was much plunder in them. They struck down the tents of those who had livestock and carried away sheep in abundance and camels, and they returned to Jerusalem. Remember, this is the thing that God had promised that the nation of Israel at the very beginning, is that with me at the forefront, with me in charge, no one is going to be able to stand against you. Not one nation can stand against you as long as I go before you into battle. So Asa is remembering this lesson. He's remembering the word of the Lord, and this is exactly what he's doing. He's putting God at the forefront and letting God do the very thing that he said that he would do. And again, as we see, that's exactly what happens. So not only did they destroy the Ethiopians, they took everything they had, beat them up and took their stuff. Yes, sir.
Asa is an example to those to follow, that God continues to do what he said he will do.
Yes. Yes. Not only do we have to hear it, we have to believe it, right? And belief means putting things into action.
Yes.
And I think that's for a lot of people, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's a sticking point. I believe, but do I do what it means to believe? Or do my actions represent my belief? Because if we say we believe, but we don't do, then is the belief truly there? That's a difficult thing. A lot of people would say, no, you can have belief without action, but the scriptures tell us otherwise. If there's belief, there's action.
Even the devil or the demons believe, but they had action behind it. They trembled.
Yeah.
So there is action, but it may not be positive action.
The action that's necessary for that belief to avail itself. For example, if I go down into the water, I can go down into the water all day long, right? But if the belief's not there, what have I really done? Taken a bath. I just got wet. So the belief has to lead to action, righteous action, the action that's necessary. And that's what Asa did. Let's look at this. Let's look at chapter 15, 2 Chronicles chapter 15. These are the religious reforms. We talked about those just a little bit, but I want you to, this is important because there's a reason that Asa knows to do the things that he's done. Much like, remember, Josiah had to be brought a word of the Lord. It had been lost because nobody had been paying attention to it. But what happens with Asa? Look at chapter 15, verse 1. The Spirit of God came upon Azariah, the son of Oded, and he went out to meet Asa and said to him, hear me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you while you are with him. Absolutely true. If you seek him, he will be found by you. That kind of alludes to Paul's Sermon on Mars Hill, right? He's there. If you look for him, you're going to find him. But here he's speaking to God's people. He says he's there, and you just have to look. All right. If you look for him, you're going to find him. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. For a long time, Israel was without the true God and without a teaching priest and without law. But when in their distress, they turned to the Lord, the God of Israel, and sought him, he was found by them. In those times, there was no peace to him who went out or to him who came in, for great disturbances afflicted all the inhabitants of the land. They were broken in pieces. Nation was crushed by nation and city by city. For God troubled them with every sort of distress. But you take courage. Do not let your hands be weak, for your work shall be rewarded. Now, I like this because it tells us how our action is to take place. When he heard these words, as soon as he heard these words, the prophecy of Azariah, the son of Oded, he took courage. Now, I want you to think about this word, the idea what he's trying to get across here when he says, and he took courage. Why would Asa, the rightful true king of Judah, the most powerful man in the kingdom, at his word, a life could be taken or a life spared? Asa took courage. Why would he need to take courage? It says he took courage and he put away the detestable idols from all the land of Judah and Benjamin and from the cities he had taken in the hill country of Ephraim, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that was in front of the vestibule of the house of the Lord. Why would he need to take courage?
He understands that God is in charge.
Right. He does. And because of that, he is going to take action. But it says he had to take courage to take that action. Because he says he takes courage first. He took courage and then he did those things. Why would he need to take courage? Even a king is wondering about the attitude and the mindset of the people that he is king over. He knows that this is not going to happen. It's not going to be a matter of he's going to do these things and no one's going to complain, right? He's wondering, okay, what is the mindset of the people? Because remember, the people had given themselves over to this. So he took courage. He bolstered, he girded his loins and did the things that were necessary to do, not caring what the people thought about it. Because he was going to receive some pushback. He's going to receive some blowback. All of these people that were very vested in the worship of all of these false idols, he's going to have to explain to these people, no, from now on, that's not going to happen in the borders of this kingdom. That is done. That detestable practice is out of here. He took away the cult male prostitutes. And if you ever want a very eye-opening study, look at what that encompassed, what that was supposed to accomplish for the people who engaged in it. Remember, one of the things they say, if you want to find out what's going on, follow the money. A lot of this had to do with simply a matter of who was receiving the benefits from all of these false gods, who was receiving the benefit from the worship of all of these false gods, who was receiving the tribute that was given to all these false gods and their priests. Asa had to screw his courage up, and he had to go and do the thing that God told him to do and not worry about what the mindset or the thought process is of the people that he was going to take away these false idols from. There's going to be blowback. But he didn't care because the word of the Lord was of utmost importance to Asa. I think that's a great lesson today. Sometimes we just have to screw up our courage and go knock on the next door of our neighbor. Sometimes we have to screw up our courage and go talk to our coworker. Sometimes we have to screw up our courage and say, no matter what, decide for yourself what you're going to do. But as for me and my house, we are going to serve the Lord. Yes, it requires even the most powerful man in the kingdom had to gather up his courage and do what was necessary.
No.
And I know a lot of these people simply didn't roll over and say, well, okay, yeah, come in and take away all of our stuff. I imagine there was probably more than a few people he had to quell the attitude and the rebellion that came along with getting rid of all of this stuff. People don't just give things up like that. They have to be persuaded to give up things like that. Okay. So he goes and he does all these things. He repairs the altar. He gathers all Judah and Benjamin. That doesn't mean, of course, that everybody, this is the representative, the elders from those various tribes and from those families. He gathers all of them, and from Ephraim and Manasseh and Simeon, who were residing with them, for great numbers had deserted to him from Israel when they saw that the Lord his God was with him. So doing the right thing in the presence of the nation did what? It magnified him. There were people from the north who said, God's with the southern kingdom, God's with Judah. I'm going. This tells us what? There were faithful people up in Israel who were waiting to see what service of the Lord was going to do. And when they saw that God was with him, they defected. From where? From Ephraim, from Manasseh, and Simeon. So you had some of these northern kingdom tribes who came down to the south because they saw this is a man who is serving God and we want to be with him. They wanted to attach themselves to greatness, and that's an important thing. Absolutely. They gathered at Jerusalem in the 3rd month of the 15th year of the reign of Asa. They sacrificed to the Lord on that day from the spoil they had brought 700 oxen, 7,000 sheep, and they entered into a covenant to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, with all their heart and with all their soul. You know, we don't have to have some formal written contract with God. God has given us a covenant. But we have to do what? Seek it with all of our heart and with all of our soul and with all of our mind. But that whoever would not seek the Lord, the God of Israel, should be put to death, whether young or old, man or woman. Now, that's probably not the best course of action today. That's not what God requires of us. But suffice it to say that if you're not in a covenant relationship with God, what's going to end up happening to you when this life is over? God is going to he requires punishment. Their idea here is to seek punishment in this life. God's is in the afterlife. But here he says, they swore an oath to the Lord, and all Judah rejoiced over the oath, for they had sworn with all their heart and had sought them with their whole desire, and he was found by them, and the Lord gave them rest all around. All right. And let's finish up with verse 19 in chapter 15. There was no more war until the 35th year of the reign of Asa. And that finishes us up to this point. Yes.
So from what to what? 35th year, and so how many years had that been?
Let's see. Asa came to, I got my chart. Let me see if I can find it. Let's see. Asa.
931 through 872.
Yeah, Rehoboam was 17 years, and then Abijam was 3, so that's 20. And then what year? 35th year. So 17 and 3 is 20, and then 20 and 35 years is 55th year of the southern kingdom. Is when war finally came to Asa, and we'll talk about that next week. There's the lessons to be learned from that. But that's it.
It had been
for tonight.
It's been involved for 20 years. Yeah, that he had, and then when he took over, we can talk about that next week. Okay.
All right, folks. Thank you so much for your attention. We will see you next week.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I see you guys here tonight.
Yeah.